God puts a lot of emphasis on naming, including having Adam name all the animals in creation as his first act. So how important are names? Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
So God takes names very seriously. For instance, he gives the name to Jacob, which means the deceiver. And throughout the Old Testament, there's names that mean very specific things that tell us about the person. You look at women, and they traditionally take their husband's surname. You look at now we have people like Elon Musk giving their son the name, XAE A-XII. So how should Christians think about names?
I mean, biblically speaking, one of the most important features in the Bible is just the names that God gives to himself. And whenever you see God giving himself a name, that's usually meaningful in that text, especially meaningful when you hear God use that name for the first time. So God takes names seriously when he's talking about himself. And when he reveals the name about himself, he's revealing things about his character. But then, you talk about how God makes man, and one of the first things that we know about man is God says, you have a job. You have to till the earth and keep it. You're supposed to fill the earth, subdue it. And okay, so you have the job description out there, but then what's the first task that man ever does? Like the first job that man ever does in an unfallen world without sin messing anything up. Under that job description, the first thing that God does is he brings all the animals to Adam, and whatever Adam called that thing, that's what its name was. Adam's first task under this is us, Adam as our federal head. First thing Adam ever does is name the creation. And so you think about how important that is in just that kind of, I almost want to use the word mythological sense, but just in the sense of how meaningful that is for understanding who we are. When you say that's really the first thing that we ever did as humans, the first human act we know of after breathing is naming.
And there's a part of it where, it ties directly to the fact that God had given man dominion over the earth. So there is a part of it. And you can see this, obviously, Adam doesn't name himself, right? God names Adam. And so, you can definitely see this, in the New Testament when it talks about, God names Adam, Adam names Eve. In the New Testament when it says, the head of a woman is man and the head of a man is Christ. There's this part of it where you see this order that naming is tied to authority, that naming is fundamentally, that the reason why parents name their children is because they have authority over them. The reason why a person who makes something can name it is because he has authority over that thing. And so naming and authority really can't be separated. And you see that, like you said, exactly what you're talking about is creation, and Adam's role was very much tied to the authority that God had given man over the earth.
It seems to me that people even just know this, right? There's an intrinsic knowledge because you see people like when Nebuchadnezzar takes people back to Babylon, one of the first things that he does, or that he has his staff do even, is to rename them, because that takes them from one position and puts them in another position where they were of that other nation. By renaming them, he's moving them into his nation, essentially. For instance, in Daniel 1:7, to them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. In all of these names, it's not just taking them out of Israel. He's very explicitly putting them into Babylon by those names, because Belteshazzar is about the worshiper of Bel. Shadrach is about the worshiper of the sun. Meshach is about the worshiper of Shach, which is another Babylonian god. Abednego, Nego is another god of Babylon. So this is all, he's taking it and making them very explicitly to say you are under the authority of the Babylonian gods now. And by taking that name and doing that, he's showing that transfer and making them know that they've been transferred. So both the person giving the name has a sense that they have authority to be able to give the name, and the person receiving the name recognizes that the fact that somebody can rename them means they have authority over them.
So I want to push back just a little bit and just say, okay, you're giving us this example from Daniel. It's very clearly a political move. It's very obvious in this case. You have a bunch of captives. Their captor is renaming them. Okay, sure, it's an exercise of power in that case, but does it follow from that it's always an exercise of authority to name or rename?
And I think, one place you can see this is if you're around, a powerful person. This is something that you can often see them do, is they'll try to give, everyone they meet, most people they meet, a nickname. And, that's not in the Bible. There's not biblical evidence, but you could just look at how powerful people operate, and the one way that they assert control of others is by giving them a new name.
I do think, again, that this is an example, so you can't derive a principle from an example. All you can get from an example is an example. But if you look at, especially Adam naming Eve when she's born rather than God naming it, it seems to me that when you look at the passages in the New Testament, like Charles referenced in 1 Corinthians 11, where it says that the husband is the head of his wife, and places like 1 Timothy 2, where it says that Adam was created first, then Eve, and so Adam had authority over Eve. It seems to me that those are where I'd look to say that there's actually an argument that says that there's authority associated with it. And this is just more the example that I think everybody recognizes this, right? If somebody has the ability to call you by something else, they are effectively exercising some kind of authority, because your name really has an impact on who recognizes you, who knows who that person's speaking of. It takes real authority to be able to change somebody's name. And that real authority can just be informal authority, but it takes real ability to shift things. So it is an authority move, it seems to me.
I mean, a name is fundamental to identity, right? I mean, it's how you're identified. It's how, and so I mean, even if you reject that identity, it's still the identity that other people know you by. And so if I can give you a name that everyone else must know you, must identify you by, and that identifies you to everyone else, that's definitely a position of, that's definitely me saying I have some level of authority, or I'm trying to assert some level of authority over you.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, when you talk about identity, part of that concept is just a history that name drags along with it. Somebody comes into Babylon and says, hey, where's Daniel? The king can, I mean, it is a power play, but he can say, Daniel, who is this Daniel you speak of? There's no Daniel anymore.
Right.
Daniel ended. There's Belteshazzar. Would you like to talk to Belteshazzar?
But
Daniel's done.
But actually what's interesting is you look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're always referred to, I think from that point forward, they're always referred
by
to as the name that was given to them by Nebuchadnezzar. That's not true for Daniel. Daniel is referred to as Daniel. So even though that Nebuchadnezzar clearly had authority over him, but at the same time, Daniel had enough authority and position from God that they would still refer to him as the one who's judged by God, which is what Daniel means, as opposed to calling him by the name that the eunuch gave him. So it's interesting that you look, and somebody that, because of who they are and because of their position, sometimes it's hard to rename them. So it seems to me there's almost, as you were saying, it was political why he did it in the first place. But at the same time, he couldn't make it stick as well with Daniel as he could with the other three, because Daniel is just of the nature of Daniel, right? I mean, when I think it's Ezekiel that writes, even if Daniel and Job and Noah are alive today, they couldn't save anybody but themselves. I mean, he has this reputation that's worldwide that causes people to still call him by his Hebrew name, even though Nebuchadnezzar tried to rename him.
I mean, you can look back at this and go, this is old world things, and this is something that only happened, when people were brought into captivity, but it's actually always been a part of even immigration. I mean, like in the U.S., when people come into the United States, I mean, I was looking up specifically about name changes, and there's talking about common law, the right to change your name whenever you want to, and all these different things. But every article I could find on it kind of said there are times when people consider it normal to change your name. And one of the when you get married, there's if maybe you die and you're switching back to a previous surname, someone dies or some significant event like that. But the other one was immigration, and they said when people when people came to the United States, it was very common, sometimes even against their will, where people would give them an Americanized version of the foreign name that they had. Sometimes a completely different version of a completely different name. And that was a very standard sort of thing, is you're coming to this country now, so that bundle of syllables, it just doesn't work here. We're going to just shave those off, and we're going to give you a name that's American now.
And sometimes it was just that the person at Ellis Island wasn't that educated, and they couldn't spell it, and I'll just write down this, and this will be your name now. Or it will be like, which is a Chinese name. Well, names without any letters or any vowels in them are a little strange in America, so they just put down something else instead of the Chinese name. But a lot of times it was really an exercise of authority by the person who wasn't given the authority, and they just go, "This is the name I'm giving you, and if you don't like it, you can leave."
And if you're looking at renaming as an exercise of authority, I mean, the clearest example of that is, transgender people, where they're changing their name. They're saying, I have complete authority over myself. I can even change my cellular biology. But, they can't. But, they're trying to by sticking a new name on themselves.
Right. They're changing their pronouns, it is about identity, and it's saying that I am the absolute arbiter of all those other things.
Because you're saying I have complete control over myself. Nobody else is allowed to tell me what to do. So God can't say you're a man. If I want to be a woman, I can be a woman, which means in the name and being able to rename, that gives the ability to argue that nobody has authority, which is what a lot of it is about. It's to argue nobody has authority over me, even as they're desperate for approval, which is how they get in that situation in the first place so often.
And it can even be a lot less extreme versions of that. Like, people that I knew growing up, they would sometimes try to change their name. Sometimes they would pick a new nickname that they were telling everyone to call them. Sometimes they just shortened their name, and, I don't know that every case, but often it wasn't a sign that they were in a good place. There was someone I knew that, later he completely rejected, what his parents had taught him, and he starts going by his middle name. Well, he's not even officially changing his name. He's going by a name his parents gave him, but it was clearly a sign of rebellion that I'm a new person now, and I'm going to go to this different name. Officially my name, but something that no one called me. But now that's what I'm going to go with.
Well, I still remember the day that I marched in front of my parents and said, nobody will call me Danny anymore. I will not respond to that name. And it was rebellion.
Right.
And they listened. And I've been called Dan ever since. Because I'm still bossy.
All of them. I know. So my dad's name is Charles. My name is Charles. And growing up, I was called Chuck. And my parents were I knew my name was Charles, but there was the reason I was called Chuck was out of practicality. And so my parents didn't have any problem with me going by the name.
Did they call you Charles or did they call you Chuck?
They would call me Chuck around the house. But when I talked to them, they were like, they were very clear, your name is Charles, but it's just, we need to call you Chuck for making sure there's no confusion.
Differentiate, sure.
And so growing up, but everyone who met me during that time period, they met me and were introduced to me as Chuck. And I remember there was a point where I was going off to school, basically. And I remember getting off in a place where no one knew me as Chuck. And I remember being glad to be able to introduce myself as Charles. There was no issue with that at all. But when I went back home, there are still people today who've only known me as Chuck. And there are times I send an email to someone and I'll put Chuck Churchill on it because they've always known me as, that's how they've known me. It's you can have a situation where you live in both worlds, where your parents have given you a name and they've told you I remember them telling me when you grow up, people will call you Charles, but I don't think they hadn't really thought through how that would exactly happen. And so they were fine with me introducing myself as Charles. But like I said, it would be hilarious if I went to some people and told me, you can't call me Chuck anymore. It would be like the stupidest thing I could do. They would just call me Chuck all the more. And so there's a part of it where you have to recognize you don't have this authority over others that you want to think you do, and that the names that you've legitimately been given, they're your names, and you don't get to be the one who controls it.
there's honor that's shown to older people. And so, like, I mean, I know people that are older than you that call you Chuck because they knew you growing up and they called you Chuck, and you don't really have the right to, I mean, the authority isn't like an absolute authority, but naming has some level of authority or some level of implicit control to it. Because, you know, if you're in a higher authority and somebody calls you something, you go, forget it. You're not calling me that. This is what you call me. But I remember, like George Bush, one of the things that he would do, George W. Bush, is whenever anybody came into the office, well, first of all, he had a great memory for all the mocking that they did about his intellectual abilities. He had a great memory because when anybody would come into his office, the first time he spoke to them, he would give them a nickname, and that's all he would ever call them again. And so it was very much a very deliberate act to control people and to say, I am more powerful than you are. But he would do this so as to be able to show, look, I'm in control of you, and you'll take it, and there's really nothing you can do about it.
And he would do it with world leaders, but frequently, like, in how he referred to them, not necessarily. I mean, there were times I'm sure he could do it to them directly because there are countries.
It's the United States, and there's not many countries that are powered with the United States.
Right, but I mean, so but it is absolutely a position of authority. I mean, there's a lot of times on sales calls that we'll go on where we'll be dealing with someone and they'll assign me a nickname. You know what I mean? Early on in the relationship, and it's
Chaz. I remember a guy who called you Chaz all the time.
Right, and it is. It's just, I mean, it is a way of establishing a pecking order. I gave you a nickname, and you understand your relationship with me now because of that. And they can say, I mean it friendly. I mean, and they can even genuinely mean it in a friendly way. But there is still an aspect. At the same
time,
there's an aspect of
people just understand that it really is about authority when you give somebody a name, even a nickname.
Yep.
We've been talking about this, the naming and renaming, and sort of kind of the negative side of things as a power play. But if you actually do have that authority, then there are positive ways and reasons to do it. I mean, for example, if Jesus does it, then it can't always be wrong. John 1, verses 40 to 42. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, We have found the Messiah, which is translated the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Now when Jesus looked at him, he said, You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas, which is translated a stone. And this is how Peter gets his name that we all know him by. Nobody calls him Simon because Jesus renamed him right when they met.
And Cephas is Pete, right? When you're saying Peter,
Cephas is just the Hebrew form,
right, of the Greek Petra or Petros, right? I mean, so yeah, it's, but yeah, I mean, and a lot of people they think, oh, it's Simon Peter, and they think, oh, his name must have always been Simon Peter. Nope, his name was. I mean, Jesus didn't throw away the Simon because he still gets referred. He didn't take away what his parents had named him, but in the end, what Christ calls him is specifically this, and he uses it. He uses it as a symbol of things going forward, and there's meaning to it.
And of course, you see that a bunch of times in Scripture. Jacob going to Israel, Abram going to Abraham. You know, other times where, you know, even with Jesus, with God telling them his name will be Jesus. So it's something you see a lot of God, you know, exercising that authority to say, here's the name or here's the new name that you're going to get.
And I think when you see that, what you have to recognize is it's kind of pointing to two common places in the world where people are renamed, right? One of them is when you're a bride. Historically and throughout almost all the nations of the earth, that the woman takes on her husband's name. I mean, she's renamed when she's married. And this is a very common thing, and it happens, happens in all countries, not just in the United States or not even in the West, but it happens in most countries that the wife has some form of renaming at marriage. And so when we think of the church and the Christians being the bride of Christ, it makes sense that we're renamed. And the other time that there's renaming is at adoption. If you adopt a child, it's very rare that, and to some extent, even the example with Daniel, they're kind of adopting them because they are now becoming part of Belteshazzar's household, or in that particular case, the eunuch's household even. And as they're becoming part of the eunuch's household, he renames them. And so when we see that, when we see Jacob renamed to Israel, we should recognize that's a picture of being adopted by God, because God is renaming them as now a son of God.
Before we're saved, there's times where God talks about you're of your father, the devil. And so there's this, when a man marries a woman, he's not trying to necessarily save her from her father. But there is a picture of it where the woman becomes part of his household, and the woman becomes part of his family. I mean, and you look at Adam. Eve came out of Adam. Eve was, when Scripture talks about it, there's a oneness there, and so there isn't, just like you're talking about it, the picture of the gospel is really strong here, because when we're saved, the church, which was formerly of the devil, is made to be of the household of God, is made to be one with Christ, and so that picture is not just this. It's not this side thing, and it's, you can definitely look at cultures where there's a mingling of names. You can look at cultures where there's other things where Christianity has been involved. The wife takes the husband's name, and it is very, very much it is something that shows the nature of the gospel in a way that other things don't show. It shows an aspect of the gospel that it's hard to see in other ways in the world.
And it seems to me that, as there has been a push to move away from the idea of a woman taking her husband's name, you get a hyphenated name, and as soon as you see a hyphenated name, in either the last generation, in this person, or in the generation before them, there was a feminist involved, because it is very much a feminist act to say, I will not take my husband's name, but I have to take it because the children need to have his name. Otherwise, there's no sense of legitimacy for the children. So therefore, I'll hyphenate the name, because I don't want to say I'm accepting his authority, because that would be anti-feminism. But at the same time, I still feel an obligation to take his name for the sake of the children. So then you get this hyphenated stuff.
I don't know that in those cases she actually takes its name. It's more like, well, what do we call these things that we made together?
Yeah,
so she has her own independent name, but then the children all get hyphenated names.
I think a lot of times, I know a lot of women that have taken, for the reason that so that their children would be named their name, they take a hyphenated name. But that may have moved too, because when I was getting married, and that was the thing, is that you debate about whether your wife would take your name or whether it would be hyphenated, but it's probably moved on from there.
Well, people do all kinds of things. Sometimes both of them take the hyphenated name. Probably the kids take the hyphenated name. There's all kinds of stuff. And this is also specific. I think in England it has gone on for a lot longer, and it wasn't always feminism that was driving it. It was more like, well, the wife's family is more famous, so we got to have the famous name in there. When we're looking at, naming, of how, naming is this this thing that, is a picture of the gospel. Sometimes it's even more more literal than that. It's unusual, but like my in-laws, their last name, because they're from India, so their last name was the name of a Hindu god. And so at some point, I think
was it immigration as well?
Related to immigration, they ended up picking a new last name from the Bible, saying we don't want to be associated with the Hindu god. We want to instead be associated with the Bible. So, that's not something that you're going to run across every day, but some parts of the world, it's a real thing of people convert to Christianity and say, wait a second, I'm carrying the name of a false god.
Well, it's very common with the Muslim community to move from an Anglicanized name to specifically
Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali.
Exactly, to pick a name that, as part of your conversion experience, or at least a public part of your conversion experience.
What about the Pope picking a new name when he becomes Pope? Maybe that's off topic. Or the King. The King can pick a new name when he becomes King.
Right. I don't think that is off topic, right? Because the reality is that they're saying, as the head of the state or the head of the church, that they are. They're renaming themselves to show that they have ultimate authority in that realm. And so, Charles kept the name Charles, didn't he, when he became king? But a lot of them don't. A lot of them change. Like the popes almost always change. But a lot of the kings change too, and they just pick a name that they want to be called. And it is very much about nobody can tell me what to do anymore.
Nobody can tell me what to do, but I'm going to be pious the 50 seconds.
Right.
I'm going to be independent.
And that happens so often, doesn't it? Is that people want to stress their independence so that they name themselves in a way that everybody else will accept, because they don't want to push it too far. People won't accept it. And so they want to act like they're an independent agent, but they aren't nearly as independent as they want to act. And so they're still constrained. It's very unusual for a pope not to take a name of an existing pope, because they want to go, I have all authority, so therefore, but people may not call me that, so I'm going to still just match with everybody else.
Yeah, not many people are bold enough to include archaic symbols and numbers in their kids' names. They're just not independent thinkers.
I mean, and there's a part of it
Or
where
weird. That would be another term.
and there's a part of it where sometimes literally people can forget that names are just words. I mean, and that even you're constrained by like even when you want to pick another word for it, in the end, you're constrained by the meaning of words to some extent. I mean, you used the phrase earlier, like there could be like a mythological aspect to it. And that's definitely with the kings when they're picking their name, or with the Pope when they're picking their name. There's an aspect of they're looking for, they're trying to draw a circle and have as many ideas in towards the center that they want to be associated with. They want to have some concept that means something, that's meaningful. And I mean, and this goes really deep. I mean, it goes all the way back to, when we talk about Adam naming Eve, he didn't just name her Eve because she's the mother of all living, but when in Genesis 3:23 it said, and Adam said, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." And so there's this part of it where not even just, this wasn't her name in a way, but it was also her, because in the end he was identifying this is what a woman is, and so this is bigger than just, he named all women, and there's like when we look at Adam as a federal head, there's this authority that he had, that he gave, that took this word that we think of as a word, but it's a name, and it's a name for how we should think about women in a real way. And it's not the totality of women, but it is very close to the center of what their meaning is. And there's an attempt from the world to get away from this and to run away from this authority and to say that Adam didn't have the authority to do this. God didn't give him this authority, but he did. And it's, we forget these things.
And with all things, like even that with woman, but also if you go back to the popes, the reason that they choose the name of a specific pope is because the name inherently has a reputation with it.
Right.
So when they choose Pope Pius the 512th or whatever it is, wherever they are, they're like 50 or something. But when they choose that's because they're trying to pull in that reputation of all the previous popes, because names aren't just the words, they're also the reputation, right?
Yes.
The reason that you should have the child takes the name of their father is because they are associating with the reputation of their father, and the father is associated with his son by that name, because so that they share reputation through the name. So the name isn't just the word, it's also the categorization of who you are and the reputation of who you are and where you came from and everything else.
A word is like a net that's been being drug along, and it's been pulling things with it and catching things as it goes. It's got associations with it. It's got connections to it. And like you said, and there's things that fall away over time, and there's things that stay very,
right.
that stay. And all of those things, we understand them instinctively. But there's a lot of times where people try to pretend like they aren't real. It's like the person who says, my clothes don't mean anything, and then they'll spend, 3 hours trying to pick out which ironic T-shirt they want to wear that day. They're lying. They know that their clothing means things.
Yeah, I think, when you study the way the Scripture talks about names, and even the word name, like what does the word name mean in Scripture? I think the way Scripture uses it brings a lot more of the baggage of the whole character, the whole, what this person is, who they are, than we normally assign that in English, where, when you read name in the Bible, you kind of have to add on some extra words sometimes to really understand what the meaning is there.
But I do think, you look at the Old Testament versus the New Testament, they're very different, right? In the Old Testament, the names usually mean something very specific. And I think a lot of that is that God is directing that and causing that to happen for us to remember that they're types. Because there's going to Jacob, right? The deceiver becomes Israel. The deceiver becomes the one who's right with God, or the one who has success with God. Well, that is really about the church. That's not really about Jacob. And so a lot of the names in the Old Testament have these direct connections. And then you go to the New Testament, you have Philip. Does he really have anything to do with him loving horses? You don't see anything related to that. Or Andrew, or Peter's a different one, because Christ there explicitly used him as the example. On this rock I will build my church. But so Christ is doing that. But in a lot of the other cases, the names in the New Testament are all very different, right? Saul really is named after a bad king in the Old Testament, so that means somehow that ties to his ministry. And we go, no, it doesn't really talk. Or Paul. that it doesn't tie to their ministry like it did in the Old Testament. And I do think that some of that is that they're types in the Old Testament, and that we're supposed to see more of it because they're actually a picture of something that then gets replaced with, quote unquote, real people that are really doing those things. And then the name all of a sudden diminishes a lot in meaning.
And just to clear up a comment, something that's said a lot is people say that Saul and Paul is when he's converted, he is then called Paul, which we even were discussing this offline earlier in the podcast. The idea is that's actually not true, and it's Saul's the Hebrew and Paul's the Greek.
And if anything, it might show a transition of him moving from being in Hebrew areas to being in,
right. In the relating of the story and the narrative, it changes because when he becomes the apostle to the Gentile, they start to call him, but that's because he's in Greek-speaking areas, right. So they start to call him Paul rather than Saul. But it has more to do with just that would have always been his name. He grew up as a Greek. I mean, he grew up as a Gentile. He was a Roman citizen,
right?
Even though he was also trained very much in the Hebrew ways. You can also see this idea of naming, right, as you go through the Old Testament. Like Beersheba, Abraham names that when they take an oath and take a covenant where Abimelech says that Abraham has authority over that, so then he renames it. You can see it in Genesis 28, 18, and 19. Then Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put at his head, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city had been Luz previously. It's interesting because if you look at that example, over time it's still called Luz until they actually start to conquer the Promised Land, and then it switches to Bethel. So he's declaring he has authority over it, calling it the house of God. But it's not until he's able to exercise the authority of it that it actually changes name and becomes called, popularly called Bethel.
Right.
I mean, right now we're going through renaming of a sort very similar to this in the United States with a whole bunch of military bases. The people or events that they were named after have fallen on disreputable times, and so the government's decided to put them under review and rename several of these that were relatively established because the naming of a place is indicative of, hey, we have authority over this. And
right, and I think in San Francisco, they renamed a school from Abraham Lincoln to something else, and then, it actually, people saw it as significant enough that it really damaged the person who was in that, and I think they lost their position and they named it back. And so people do see names as significant because all of a sudden it is saying that, Abraham Lincoln wasn't woke enough, so he has to be off the list, and then other people go, how dare you do that? And so it very much is an exercise of authority. And you look at, other places in the world when somebody gets elected, all of a sudden, St. Petersburg gets named to Stalingrad, and, this is what people do is they rename places to say, I am in charge here, I have authority. And I agree with you entirely that's what they're doing with military bases is to basically say we're woken and we're in control and nobody else can express an opinion to say these people should be honored. That's just outside the pale of acceptability.
In some ways, it's exactly like Bethel and Luz. I mean, in a sense, there was a war, there was a conflict over whose authority was going to keep the name, and there can be times where this kind of goes back. I mean, you can see it in, like you're talking about with the Abraham Lincoln. There was a war in that one where the one side pushed it over and the other side pushed back and said, no, we're going to keep the name there. And it is, so when you think about it, authority and power kind of can be tied together. There can be someone who has the authority to give a name and they don't have the power to
cause it to
right.
hold.
And you can even see it in situations like there was, there's the Rechabites in Scripture, and the person who gives them the command is Jonadab, the son of Rechab, right? And so, so they're known by Rechab, but but the one who gave them the command that gives them the distinctives of how that they don't drink wine or that they don't live in houses was Jonadab, and so Jonadab has the sort of authority, but they're known by the name of Rechab, and
that's because he's honoring his father, right? Because he doesn't do it, and like this military things, those renames, they're really significant, like Luz and Bethel, right? It's really significant that Jacob's going and saying this is the place where God abides, right? This is basically the Promised Land because the new heaven and the new earth, the sign that it's the new heaven and the new earth is God the Father and God the Son. They abide there. There is no moon, there is no sun, that they are the light of it. And so when he comes and says, this is the house of God, I mean, it's all typifying that this is the promised land. But it doesn't happen right away because the kingdom has to be conquered before it becomes the promised land and before it becomes the house of God, which is what Bethel means. And so you have this, and you can see that depending on the authority, it's really saying something about the authority based on the names. Like when you change the bases, the names of the bases, what it used to be is they said military prowess is what should determine whether somebody's honored. Whether they're a Confederate, whether they're in the Union Army, it doesn't matter. We should honor them for their position, for their prowess, for how well they fought, and these other things. And now the military is saying those things don't matter. These other things, we'll name it after somebody that didn't do anything because they were black, and they were the first lieutenant that was black, so they name a base after that. Not for what they did, but for who they are. And that really shows an underlying mindset of the authorities and how they're thinking about things. So when you see how things are named, it really reflects back on the nature of the authority and the nature of what the person in authority says is important.
Or, I mean, take the case we have in North Carolina, Fort Bragg in Fayetteville is being renamed Fort Liberty. And, I guess we either ran out of people or we ran out of confidence and courage to name it after another person. So let's pick a generic.
Some of them are getting named after.
Compared to the other people they were renaming the base after, I think Liberty was the best one. I mean, the list of... I don't remember the entire list, but some of these people did not deserve to have bases named after them.
One of them literally was like a lieutenant that never did anything. Not that it was wrong for them to be a lieutenant. There's a lot of lieutenants that don't do anything that's spectacular, but it was strictly because of their race. That's the only reason that the base was named after them. And that doesn't really inspire a group of people. It used to be that the names were trying to inspire a group of people to be like that person. But now that's not what they use military names for bases anymore.
Well, they do.
Or if it is.
Right. And in the end, they're...
Kind of, but you can't change your race. So they're not really inspiring people to do anything other than to not participate if you're not of... Right.
I mean, and it's right. I mean, in the end, it's always about ideology. And it's always about, and there is a part of it where what's really dangerous is two things. One, when the ideology is bad, or two, when a person will lie to you about what the actual ideology is behind what they did. I mean, both of those things are evil. I mean, you can have just a bad ideology, and and you could argue that there have been great groups that had a bad ideology of what they aimed for to, of what they named things after. When people were naming things after false gods, that's a bad ideology, but you can understand why they chose false gods, because they were choosing something bigger than man, and that's and so there is this part of it where when people say what their ideology is and it doesn't make any sense, they're usually lying.
Which what we're saying
Maybe
here is not that it's a necessarily bad thing to go back and rename places, to rename your military bases. There can be reasons for doing that, but recognize there are reasons for doing that there's an ideology, there's a worldview behind that when you make that kind of shift, that you really are conforming to some sort of standard or other. And it is an exercise of power, it is an exercise of authority, and the question really is that a good one? And when you are dumping a name and replacing it with a new name, you're dropping a section of history that the old name drug along with it. You're imposing a new history on it that's going to stand from that point forward. And that's not always a bad thing. But why is it happening? We can say, okay, there's a lot of woke reasons for why it's happening at this particular moment in time. That wasn't true for Jacob when he's naming a place Bethel.
Right. And, when you think about it, right, after World War II, where there's famous generals after World War II, some of the generals that nobody really remembered from the War of 1812, why wouldn't you, take that name away and replace it with something that's going to carry more weight and carry forth what you want to do? If you're trying to set up examples of great military leaders, it's better to name things after military leaders that are worth remembering, as opposed to ones that were, well, the war wasn't that big. We have all these bases now. We need to choose somebody. Just like my expectation is in the next 30 or 40 years, these bases will be renamed again, a lot of them, because they're not named after anybody that's very inspiring. Because what do they inspire? Really nothing. They didn't do anything. They just were.
You can just
that's
hope
not very
new names are in English.
Right. That's a good point, that they very well might be, because if another military comes in and takes us over, which is far from outside the realm of possibility, then yeah, all the names will be in a different language because it will be about authority.
I mean, you're basically saying they picked some weak names. They picked names that are already, from the moment they were picked, are already in line for just naturally getting replaced at some point down the road.
Right, and part of it though is they're also by those names they're saying that our military is weak, which is a really dangerous thing to say in the world. And they are saying our military is weak because anybody looking outside from another country that looks at the name says they're not picking people that are strong or powerful or people that China would love for us to follow the examples of some of the people that we're naming bases after now, because that would mean that we're a military that could not stand up to China at all. And so you're kind of telegraphing that to the other nations that this is what we're going to hold as a high ideal, which is not what you really want to do when you're in when the world's a dangerous place. And
of course, they would say that they are reflecting strength, but it's a different type of strength than we used to have. They're saying this is the new strength is this. Well, is the new strength as good as the old strength?
Another thing that's important about names is that they actually identify authority, right? So when a child takes his parent's name, we think about, you name it and I called my firstborn son Joshua, but I didn't just call him Joshua, I called him Joshua Horn, which automatically identifies the authority structure between the father and the son. And that's even why some of the hyphenation, like we were talking about before. And so one of the purposes of names is to connect that and declare the authority structure.
I mean, we talked about this with, like you said, with wife taking the husband's name, but you can even see it specifically in Scripture in Isaiah 62, verses 1 and 2. It says, "For Zion's sake, I will not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not rest, until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a lamp that burns. The Gentiles shall see your righteousness, and all kings your glory. You shall be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord will name." And so, you can see, we're in the Old Testament, God is looking forward and he's talking about the church, and he's talking about that he is going to give he is going to take and give the church a new name. And we know that the church is the bride of Christ. And so there's this part of it where these things they're very tightly tied together, that in the end, there's a reason. It's identifying the authority structure of the church. It's identifying who is the head of the church. It's identifying whose name they're going to bear, who's going to give them the name, and all these things are just very tightly connected.
So if that's all that tightly connected, what's the new name?
I think it's probably Jeremiah 33:14 through 16. "Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will perform that good thing which I have promised to the house of Israel and to the house of Judah. In those days, and at the time I will cause to grow up to David a branch of righteousness. He shall execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. In those days Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell safely. And this is the name by which she will be called, the Lord our righteousness." And so when God's thinking about names, he's not necessarily just thinking about, the short form. Like Joshua Horn is, Dan Horn's son, and that horn connects us together. He's thinking about the real connection that's between the church and God, which is the righteousness of God. He gives the righteousness to his church, and so her reputation is righteousness, so her name reflects that. And so as soon as you hear the name of the church as the Lord our righteousness, it's automatically connects it back to God, because God is the only one that's perfectly righteous. And so the name there is a stronger connection than the natural connection that we have in human naming, if that makes sense. I think we said this before, but I think it's worth repeating, is that when we look at a wife taking her husband's name, this, the hyphenation and all that stuff, a lot of it is saying that they won't accept authority, or they keep their old name and they don't accept the name. We should just recognize how much this is trying to deny the fact that there's an authority structure in place that God put. And the denial of that fact frequently leads to divorce. We shouldn't, when you refuse to say, "I'll be known by my husband's name," you've already set up this separation, and the two aren't becoming one in a real way, because the name really has a way of association. And if you're intentionally disassociating yourself from your spouse, there's a good chance that in the future you will actually physically be disassociated from your spouse. And so we think names don't matter, but if you're always calling somebody by, the husband by one name and the wife by another, this really has effect to keep a separation there that's supposed to go away in marriage.
And you can see this with marriage. I mean, it's had that effect of, it's very common for people to get married and not have joint bank accounts. It's very common for people to, it's very common for them to not bring their, they come in with separate possessions and they keep those possessions separate. They keep, they keep, they have, just everything starts out. It's not, like you said, it's not just the names, but the practice has followed with it. And so I think what you're saying is there's a part of it where you don't have to understand the symbolism. The symbolism is real. The symbolism is reality. And so what you do with the symbols, you actually do with the reality. And so your treatment and your handling of those things. I mean, there's a part of it where I think it's very easy for people to hear someone talking about the woman wants to reject her husband's authority. And they look at men and they go, this man isn't worthy of having authority over me. Then don't marry him. I mean, you know what I mean? There is this part of it where it goes, the point is you're supposed to marry someone who you can follow, who you want to follow. And when you deny this, the name is meant to represent something that the reality follows through on.
Right.
And so there's this part of it where when you deny the reality of these things, when you deny that she's supposed to take his name, you deny the fact that that the man is supposed to aspire to be someone who she would want to follow after, who would take care of her, who would lead her, who would do all these things. And so these things get completely lost.
I mean, you're putting the woman in a pretty impossible situation right there, because you're saying that is what she's supposed to want, and yet everything in the culture's telling her you're not supposed to want to follow any man.
Right.
And so she's in this position of, well, I can't submit to any man. So,
right.
So and you see the number of ways that we're getting creative with the way that we're subverting this particular thing. I mean, my internet thinks that I'm interested in these sorts of articles, so they pop up all the time about people like, well, men are taking their wives' names now, or they're melding the surnames, anything but hyphenation, because that's just clunky after one generation. You can't do it again.
Unless you're Spanish, where you have like 300 names, which gets to be really horrible.
It does. It's just it's not economical. But so it's anything except let's do what our culture's been doing for several hundred years.
There's other people who don't have the option to choose the name because they're not getting married. They're the children, and there's children out there who want to change their name. And maybe there's some cases where their father has abandoned them and they never saw him again, and they were raised by someone else. Maybe in that case it's appropriate because he has cut himself off.
That is effectively adoption, which is a very legitimate time to change a name, it seems to me.
But you do have the command to honor your father and to say, I'm going to get rid of the name that my father gave me. It's hard to see how that's not dishonoring, unless it's something, a rare situation or something where it is, in rebellion to God. But typically, how can you say you can honor your parents while getting rid of the name?
And just having a different name creates, it is very much you're saying you're not identified with that person and you're separated. And look at the divorce rate in Hollywood. Almost no one in Hollywood takes their husband's name. Right? They all keep their own name because my career is too important. I don't want to ruin my stage name. Now, some of them in their private life take it. And if they do that, those marriages have a much higher success rate. But the ones who don't and that they keep their stage name in their life, the divorce rate in Hollywood is extreme, so that you have one or two people that have been married a long time and people just talk about how amazing it is that they're married for a long time. And so we should just recognize that you have this pattern, and so that you aren't identified with that person, and it means you're not identified with them, and that means that there's a real separation. The world then pushes you to be separate because they're not going to identify you with that person. And again, we said this before, but it's clearly acceptable to rename at adoption because that's the promise of Scripture. In Revelation 2:17 it says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat, and I will give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who received it." And so it's clear that Christ renames his children. It's clear that is That is what he is doing, and he has every right to do that, and that is a proper thing to do. So to say, this man raised me and this man, had relations with my mother, the one who raised you is the one who, the one who you do the works of, right, is the biblical term, right? If
Right.
you're saying, this is the man that I'm following, when you follow Christ, he's your father. And so you do the works of Christ, and so therefore he has every right to rename you. And it's the same thing if you have a child that when they're raised by somebody else, so that they're saying, I'm going to do the works of this man, that he is my true father, then it makes perfect sense to take a name in that case.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't make sense to do anything different in a sense, because if you think if it's really an adoption in that sense, well, what does an adoption mean at just the most basic level? Adoption means you become part of a family, and a family is this thing that's denoted by the names of it. And so being part of it but not being part of it by name almost doesn't even compute. So,
and to some extent, that's even what we were talking about before, where if you don't even know who your father is, the reality is the name is just a placeholder for a greater set of things, right? That, as Christ said, that, you do your father's work. And so it's kind of saying, I'm associated with them. I'm associated with this reputation. This is who it is to be a horn. In that if you don't even know what that person is, if he was just there and he's a name on the birth certificate that you've never met, how can you even associate with that?
It's an association with people. It's an association with a reputation, with a history, with various relationships, and it's a promise of things to come. It's when you get that name, all of a sudden you're included in inheritance, and that's the real payoff in some sense for it.
Except that most people don't receive an inheritance anymore. That should be the payoff.
But scripturally speaking,
right,
that's
that
the
should
point.
be.
That's the point of adoption. That's the difference between somebody who is a slave
Servant
in a
in the
household and somebody who's a son. Is they're the one who's going to receive something in the day of inheritance.
Right.
So scripturally speaking, that when you hear them talking about adoption, the point of adoption is now your name is on the list
Now
of
you're a
people.
joint heir.
Now you are a joint heir with Christ.
And you look at the roots of our naming, and it's connected to this idea of it. Where if your father changes, well, then your name changes. People like Johnson. Well, that's because when they were coming up with last names, the head of that family, his father's name was John, so his last name was Johnson. You could look at the scripture. Typically, they don't have last names, but in the when it's listing the prophet or whoever it is, it says Ezra, the son of whoever, and that was effectively their last name, directly just their father's name.
And it's interesting because it would flow so that they would switch, right? Because they frequently would go back 2 generations, say, where it would be distinct. And it even might be the number of ancestors that were still living. But they would go back and they say the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so.
Right.
But their son then would just go back 2 generations, so there wouldn't be this long line. Now in the restructuring names, what we're doing is we're connecting through a much longer line than used to be in biblical times. That there was, it's only usually 2 or 3 generations, but at the same time, it's almost like the Spanish where they do it, where they keep every maiden name going back. And so they have this huge list of names, right? When they used to read the name of the king of Spain, it would be like 200 names long or something like that, because they'd have every single one. And so there was this line back, and that was through the mother that they were adding the names on. But when you look at, it's just interesting that now what we've done is said, there's our last name, our surname that was given 300-400 years ago in some cases, and that's just flowed down or even longer. And it's just interesting because it's very different. It used to be just referring to your father, so you had your reputation was connected to the people who people would have known. Now it's connected to a longer line.
So, you also, if you look at the sons of Jacob giving their children a last name, that sticks around for a long time. The tribes,
right?
It could affect it. Because they also did know a lot further back as well.
Right, and they did know, like Jonadab and being a Rechobite and Rechab, right? There's not just the main tribe, but there's different prominent people that end up having a line of people that are named after them and that identify back, because it's really identifying with a reputation at that point. But now what we've done is kind of said fixed, that it's always going to be Horn, even though there might be different people that come along that have higher reputations than others. We don't shift like they used to.
If any of you have ever read War and Peace, or like me, just slogged through the beginning part of it. But in Russian, I mean, there will be each person that you run into, there will be multiple names that they're referred to by, because there's like their family name, there's their kind of like personal name. I mean, there's all these names that kind of give different aspects of like who their father was, but then there's the longer family name that they, you know what I mean? But I mean, in the end, they have all these identities, and that's part of their culture and they're framed by all of those things.
And their formal first names, and then their pet first names,
Right.
and then the French version of their name, and
Right.
So in Nigeria, basically everybody is their name, their father's name, and their father's name,
Okay.
and that's their name. And so then when you get married, you take your husband's name, and I'm not sure, but then they also have an English name, which is kind of like the same thing. But for the African names, for a man, you'd have a given name, and then you'd have your father's name and your grandfather's name.
So, I mean, we've talked about throughout the episode that, I mean, early on we talked about how there are names given, and then like Jesus renames Peter, gives Peter a new name. And we've talked about how this is a picture of authority, but there's lots of times where names like this are given in culture, and a lot of times people don't think about the way that this reflects authority. Nicknames that, there are people who will give, like Donald Trump, and like you talked about George W. Bush, they would give, low energy Jeb Bush during the thing. But there are nicknames like in school, where you get nicknames in school, and frequently they're handed out by someone who has some level of social status, and they give it to that person and they stick. And that's just a form of authority. And even if it's just a small group of friends and they give nicknames out, there's an aspect of that group of friends exerting authority over one another in a sense.
And I mean, when we're talking about authority, we're not necessarily talking,
Lordship.
And we're not talking about an authority that is necessarily a structured official authority, like a father or like a civil magistrate. But the reality is that in a group of people, there's people that have more, dynamism than other people, and so they kind of drive the thing, and a lot of times they're the ones that give nicknames. And so it can be just a personal charisma, it can be just gravitas, the favorite word that they use to say how terrible George Bush was. It can just be that there are people in the group that they can call somebody by something, and then other people will start doing it. Which, like you said, you used Donald Trump as an example in the 2016 election. I mean, he was able to use that very effectively, because obviously I suspect in business he's done it a lot, and that in business he used it to just by his presence and everything else and his charisma, that he's able to convince other people to use it, and so he's able to control situations with it. And that's effectively how he won the nomination. It wasn't because he had authority over low energy Jeb, or even that it was that great of a name. It's just that in doing it, he was able to carry a crowd with him, to join with him. And that has real authority and real control. And you can see that in 2016, because I think that's a big reason why he was able to win the election.
Right.
Lion Ted, you
Right.
remember the names that he came up with, and he had the persistence, the will, the presence. He had all these things so that he could carry it off, and other people would start calling him by that name.
And you're saying in that kind of circumstance that it's not exactly the case that we're talking about a legitimate exercise of authority.
Right.
It's more an assertion of authority that
other people accept.
that sticks, and so it's a authority in the wild.
This is sort of the line between power and authority. I mean, there's a part of it where someone doesn't necessarily have authority, but they have the power to do something, and so they do it. And by doing it, they are, like I said, there's other people recognize it, but they weren't given the authority by God directly. It's just they're taking it through their power.
And it's an acceptance of power, right? I mean, if you look at a gang, like gangs, a lot of times they call people by nicknames. If you want to figure out who the next leader of the gang is, it's the guy who gives nicknames that other people follow. In the end, he'll be the one that ends up being the leader of the gang, because it really is authority. It is really an exercise of power, even if you don't have the authority. But then the authority a lot of times lines up with the power. Because if you have the power over the people are willing to follow you, and that grants you authority.
And I think there's a part of it too with friends and nicknames is there can be the form where there's the social groups where people give people nicknames to kind of control them, and then there can be groups of people where they're looking for identity in that group of friends, and so there's this kind of mutual willingness to enter into this relationship where they give each other a kind of an identity. That they give each other an identity. You can have. And you can see this on sports teams. You can see this on just people who went to college together and they hung out with a group of friends and they all liked each other and they sort of mutually gave each other nicknames. And it's a way of there is still within it. There's a pecking order and there's
it's still that idea of identifying with one another, right?
And whereas
it could
Jeb
be that
Bush
those
didn't
names,
want to.
right.
Jeb Bush wasn't.
He didn't want to be called low energy.
He didn't want to be called low energy. He kept complaining. Ted Cruz, cruise missile. He didn't like Lion Ted, but so yeah, it's.
But those kinds of nicknames might only have really meaning within that group setting.
Right.
It's not necessarily that nickname's going to carry over outside of a particular context or set of contexts.
But when that person steps into that circle, he could be the president of a company outside of that circle, and he steps into that circle, and he becomes that place, that position that his nickname has given him in that group. And so there's this part of it where still the identity, it is a real identity when you're in that area, and
those are nicknames that don't get called outside of that group, right? I mean, if you're referring to somebody else to a third party, you don't use that nickname. That nickname is more just a name to separate and identify because, what you call somebody does separate you out from other people.
I remember, a baseball player, Oral Hershiser, who is this very sort of tweedy, professorial kind of looking fellow. And his manager said, "Oh, your nickname's going to be Bulldog. We're going to call you that." And he was a very dominant pitcher, but there was nothing about him. It was just an assertion of, we're going to put this on you, and we're going to call you this, and you're going to become that kind of person.
Pure marketing.
It was pure marketing, and it worked.
One thing that happens in dating is the man and the woman, hopefully a man and a woman, they actually often give pet names to one another. And that's actually a very dangerous thing because if they're in a position where they don't have authority over one another to do it, separates them out from other people. They actually create, like we were talking about before, if you create a clique that you do it. And so that couple that is not to the point where,
they're in no covenant relationship.
They're no in covenant relationship. So like with my children, it was like you can't call each other by pet names until you betroth. Then you can, because then you do have that authority. You do have that connection to one another. But it's actually very dangerous. And people, when they start to call their boyfriend or their girlfriend a pet name, so it's just an exclusive name between the two of them, they're creating an identity that doesn't exist yet. Because until they're ready to be married, they really shouldn't have that separate identity. And it creates relationships that often go to places that they shouldn't go because they're acting married. They're acting like they're covenanted together, that they're connected to one another when they really don't have that connection. And that's a good way, men manipulate women all the time. And that's one of the ways men manipulate women is by giving them pet names so that the woman starts to act like she's under his authority, and that usually ends in sex.
So if I back this up, let's say somebody's has just moved the slider bar and jumped ahead to this point in the podcast for whatever odd reason. It sounds
because the rest of it was boring.
Dan Horn is against pet names in dating relationships.
Yes, I am.
What kind of crazy thing is that? But if you've been following along, then what we're saying here is naming is an act of power. It's an assertion of authority, and that you should not do that in a relationship until the power and authority are actually legitimate.
Right.
And let's be
otherwise it leads to places that it shouldn't go. And there's a lot of, in previous generations, there would be times where, somebody that was dating somebody else would still call him Mr. and Miss. It wouldn't be that you wouldn't break that wall of informality down until you were allowed to be informal with one another. And now we just go there right away and very quickly, which breaks down all other kinds of informality too, which is very dangerous.
There are also going to be people who have a wrong view of the marriage relationship, and they would say that if naming is authority, that a wife has no place giving her husband a nickname or a pet name in the relationship. And Scripture is very clear that the wife does have an authority over her husband's body. She owns his body, and he owns her body. I mean, and I think we've said this in other episodes. I just like to say it because I think it's something that's really been lost. There have been times where you've given women their husbands were doing things that the wives did not believe they should be doing. And there are times where you've told them, you should have told your husband, if you continue to do this, I'm going to go to the elders and talk to them, because you are taking our body and taking it in places where you should not be taking it. And there is this part of it where, I mean, a wife really does have authority over her husband's body. And when you deny that, there's a real problem in marriage. I mean, you can... The view that husbands are the head of the wife does not turn the wife into an absolute doormat with no authority and no place in the relationship. Scripture elevates the wife and gives her a real place and causes her to be a protection to her husband. And so there is a place in that intimacy for them to have a way to, for her to be able to give him a nickname in that intimacy. And yet at the same time, if she uses that incorrectly, she can show great dishonor to her husband, because like Sarah, who calls her husband Lord, there's a time and a place where she should not refer to him in that way, because she needs to respond to him with respect and with obedience. And so, I mean, both of those things can exist at the same time, and it's really important that not be lost.
So you're saying the woman shouldn't call the man Lord until they're engaged.
That's very true.
That's very true.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
Lord.
Certainly as fathers, we have, the responsibility to name our children. And so what things should we consider when you go to name like a child?
Stay away from mythology.
Not naming them after false gods is like a really good idea.
And even
if it's Spider-Man.
And even I was referring back to the idea of, there's a part of it where the way that kings think about their name, and the way that is, you shouldn't try to make your child larger than life. You shouldn't try to make your child your child should have a name that he can aspire to, but it should be a name that he can aspire to without sinning. It should be a name that, and so there's this part of it where sometimes people craft these names that they exceed the limits of what someone can properly pursue without violating what God has called us to be and the way that we should think of ourselves. And so, I mean, there is this part of it where you should have the proper view of what a man is, what a woman is, and what their relationship to God should be, and name them, and start with that proper context when you think about it.
I like the way you put it, that it's something that they can aspire to. If you think about names that are aspirational, what kinds of things fall into that category? Well, one of the things you can aspire to is to be like your father. Be like your grandfather. Pick a family name, somebody, pick a historical name.
Fort Bragg Churchill.
I mean,
wow,
that would be pretty epic, but... Not sure I recommend it.
And I mean, the idea of it being aspirational is important, right? Because, or at least that's one choice that you can make that's important, is that names are heard a lot. When they get called by their name throughout their whole life. And so even if, you use a name like Joy, I mean, if you're constantly called Joy, you'll probably do one of two things. You'll either aspire to be joyful, or you'll just become grumpier and grumpier. But it will actually have an influence, right, depending on if your heart is to rebel or if you're desiring to fulfill the aspirations that your parents had for you. So those type things, they have a real influence because you hear them so much. I mean, the other names, and you look in Scripture and in history, is that a lot of times people name things after, especially the Puritans, they would name things after things that were happening at the time, so that a name can be historical, to remember the history. And that's even like in Nigeria, where I was saying they do their father and their grandfather. I mean, that's like the man that works for the church that's over in Nigeria, he intentionally named his son after his grandfather so that his grandfather's name wouldn't be lost, so they have the same name, they're just in a different order. But that way he keeps the name. But that's because to him, his grandfather was a huge influence, and he wants his son to remember the history of his grandfather, even though his son never met Zingak's grandfather.
What are some examples of event-based names? I mean, like Not Quite a Red Wave Churchill.
So one of the the pilgrims are coming on the Mayflower, and a baby is born on the Mayflower, and is named Oceanus.
Okay.
That's probably the most famous one.
Okay.
But I mean, there's wrestling, because the person was having a lot of difficulty wrestling with God when the baby was born.
So
they
even
called
like
him
even like
wrestling.
very like familial event things. I mean, that
Right,
weren't-
very
okay.
much
I
things
wasn't
that
sure
they
if it
were
was-
saying that this is what you came out of. This is the situation that was in, and this is when God blessed us with you. So understand your history, and it can be very specific to what was going on in that family at that time, is what a lot of the names were. And so, just this idea though of, again, that's there's an emphasis there that you're connecting the child to the history of the family, so that they have their identity in the family, and they have that they're saying that the things that happened to this family, even though you were just born or hadn't been born yet, that these are things that really happened to you, because there's a connection there. And so sometimes you go to history to more, like in the case of Zingak, like his grandfather was very influential in the village and stuff, and so he wants that connection back. But, so to remember the history and remember where you are and to how that connects to you. So it could be, they would use names that are events that are happening that they say are really significant, that influences the child, even though the child doesn't remember the experience. But because of the connection through the family, they see it.
And this is something that I think a lot of people in modern times don't think all that much about. I think for a lot of people, the only consideration is, does it sound cool? And
Right.
they don't really go beyond that. But you look like historically, and there's a book, Albion Sea, that looks at different groups from England that settled America. And one of the distinguishing factors between those groups is how they named their children. And it wasn't always conscious. It was sometimes they were just doing the thing that all their friends did.
It was just the fashion, right?
Yeah, but sometimes it was very conscious, and with the Puritans it was very conscious, where the Puritans, many of them were choosing names that were very different than the people around them. And I think that the famous Puritan names are the ones that are character trait based, which is how a lot of the Old Testament names would have been, that they were literally just the Hebrew word,
like deceiver and stuff like that.
Right, and so that so the Puritans brought that back. And
so is there going to be a deceiver horn?
we'll see. I mean, anything's possible. I have my own list of rules, very strict rules. I'll spare you all from hearing them, but I have a long list of rules.
I hope they're more aspirational than deceiver.
Well, I could do my own solo podcast on my naming rules, but I don't think people want to hear that.
Oh, I don't.
No, I'm pretty interested now.
Our interest is piqued.
Well, we'll have to save that for another time. But I think important in that is focusing on the meaning, and it's already been said, but what are you don't have to do the character trait names necessarily, but what does this name communicate actually, more than just a pretty sound. Not that you should pick names that sound bad, but I think meaning is a pretty core consideration. And
I think that there's a lot of names like Philip, right, that it means lover of horses, and nobody really knows that that's what it means out in society. And so, so it can't just be the meaning, right? I think
right.
the closer you
meaning
get to
more
it, the
than
more.
Not the translation.
A lot of it is
but
association.
What meaning does it carry? Is it your
Right.
father's name? Is it your grandfather's name? Is it George Washington's name? Does the word does it itself actually have is it mercy? That has a clear meaning, but I'm not talking about just definition.
Another thing that's important to remember when you're thinking about naming is that this will be the first impression that people have of that person throughout their life. So, somebody like Jacob, where he's called the deceiver. We think of Jacob and we don't associate it, but if he's talking to any Hebrew, they go, hey, this is, the deceiver, the son of Isaac. Not a great name. And so we should just recognize that it will inspire an impression that will be the first impression for that child for the rest of their life.
And I think it's important what you said too, is throughout their life. It's important to remember that your child is not going to be a baby or a little child their entire life. A lot of times people don't think about the fact that, they'll pick a name, but they don't think about the fact that they're going to be 3, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. They're going to be, one day they're going to be an 80-year-old.
AE, A-XII, he won't like that name when he's 30.
When he's in his robot body, it'll make perfect sense, But we've gotten to a day and age where people choose names for like avatars and things like this, and they choose usernames and screen names, and some of those things start turning names into more of a game than a serious exercise. And so it's, you know what I mean? And so there's this part of it where it can just be really easy to disassociate yourself from the fact that this is a person who's going to live their entire life with this thing.
And you really are going to have an influence on how they live their life and how they think about themselves, because that's what they're going to hear a lot. And it really has an influence. And it's a way that a parent can exercise their authority to really have an influence on their child in a way that's subtle and isn't as direct as they might think. But their child's going to hear that name over and over again.
And I mean, there's a corollary to that that's really important, that if you've picked a name because of a history that name has, family history or something, you, in addition to naming that child, that you have the responsibility to educate them in that history. Hey, right. I named you after this Bible character because I wanted to see these sorts of things develop in you as you grew up. I named you after your grandfather because he was a war hero. I named you after this virtue because I want, our culture needs more of that. You've got to make sure that your children understand, if you made self-conscious decisions, that those decisions are not opaque to them.
Right. As opposed to, like, I was named after a Bible character because the Roman Catholic Church said you could only use a certain set of names. So, because the Roman Catholic Church, if they're not a saint, you're not allowed to name them that.
Or if you live in Iceland, I mean, there's a state-mandated list of names that.
But I know in my mother's generation, in her generation, that every single person in that generation in her family every female was named Mary. And I know of some other families that in that generation, every male was named Joseph. That those were the only names that the Roman Catholic Church would baptize you with. So everybody had the same name. So my aunt was Mary Vera, and my mother was Mary Joyce, because you had to have Mary. And then nobody went by the name Mary because that was. But, I mean, you still hear
Total
Mary
confusion.
Jane and other things like that. That's because the Roman Catholics would require all the women to be named Mary, all the babies.
You can still yell Caitlin into a crowd of college girls and get about 15, no. A flock of Jennifers when I was growing up. Is what we
Right. I
called
mean,
it.
and we should recognize that just because the name's fashionable doesn't mean that that's a good one to choose, because
Or
names
bad.
or bad.
So we've been talking about naming and naming your children, and to this point we've been talking about the given name, the Christian name that they have, but there's the one that you give them that you don't really have any choice about, and that's your last name, your surname, and your sons are going to live with that for the rest of their life, and their daughter until, Lord willing, they get married. And that name could be just as meaningful, if not more so, than that first name, than the one that you agonize over with your wife and you pick for them. And we've been talking about giving them names, and when you talk about the first name and you talk about giving them that name, and then you say, oh, I'm going to give you this other name too, given those two senses, it's entirely different. It means two completely different things. That this one, I'm giving you a label that I hope you can aspire to. This other one is, I'm giving you a history, a reputation, and
That you hope is aspirational.
that I hope is worth being aspirational. Everything about your own character that comes along with that name, then your child inherits that.
That's what I meant by that. You should work to make it aspirational.
You can bless or curse your child with how you name them with that first name. You can bless or curse your child with the last name that you give them. Which one of those is harder to make a blessing?
Right, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Is that the second one is harder to be passing on a reputation to your children, so that it is a blessing to them, the reputation that you have in the world that they are connected to, because it is not your name, it's your reputation, right, that they're going to be connected to, and there's nothing you can do. They will be connected to it. They are identified with you. And so a father has a duty to make that name aspirational, meaning it's a good thing to be a Horn. It's a good thing to be a Sides. It's a good thing to be a Churchill. And that's what men should be working for, is for their last name to be aspirational.
Not for yourself, not for your own glory, but for the glory of God. And that God, you know what I mean? And
right, and the glory of God in the fact that people aren't going, oh, he's a horn, but going, we know horns are a blessing to the people around them.
Right.
Which is the same thing that you're saying, but in a very practical way that doesn't even necessarily, it is, the idea is they should see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So it's not like in a preachy way, but it's in a real way that you go, this is what it means to be a horn.
Because there are people out there I've grown up hearing Christians talk about creating a Christian dynasty and all these. And there's this part of it where it's like, God doesn't call you to create a dynasty. God doesn't call you to seek to seek the glory of your name and all these things. In the end, it's that whatsoever your hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might, and honor your Father who is in heaven, and let them see your good work. It is those things that God has called Christians to do. And
it is Jonadab saying, "Hey, Rechabites, they don't." Judgment's coming, so you don't build houses. You live in tents. You don't drink wine because judgment's coming, and Jonadab was saying, this is the reputation that you need to aspire to. Right. And that's what everybody, when they take your last name, that's what you should be doing. And that's true for wives too, is that like you were saying before, if you're not willing to submit to him, don't marry. And if, very similar to that, if you don't want to go where he's going, don't marry him and join to him. And so husbands have a responsibility to be aspirational with their name for their wife and for their children. So as you've heard, we've talked a lot about the importance of naming because it really is a picture of what Christ does when he takes a people and gives them a new name that causes them to be separated from the world, causes them to be known by the Lord our righteousness. And so as we think of our name, think of the name that you're giving to your children, not just their given name, but think of the reputation you're passing on because you're really connecting them to yourself. And should you be connecting them to yourself, or should you fix yourself so that they can bear a name that will be a blessing to the world? As we think about names and think about the connection to them and the use of authority, the church needs to be more deliberate about what they're setting, how they're thinking about names, so that the names are a blessing and the names are a call to greater things. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.